"You're in the wrong section," the supply sergeant snapped, barely looking up from his inventory clipboard. "Medical personnel report to the rear staging area. This is for combat units only." She stood quietly, medical bag slung over her shoulder, waiting for him to finish his dismissive lecture. When he finally glanced at her dog tags, his expression shifted from irritation to something approaching terror. The tags didn't just identify her as medical corps. They carried a classification level that made his hands shake as he processed what he was seeing. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The pre-dawn darkness at Forward Operating Base Crimson stretched across the Afghan landscape like a heavy blanket, broken only by the harsh glare of security lights and the occasional flicker of generator-powered equipment. The air carried the familiar mixture of diesel fumes, dust, and the metallic scent of weapons that had been cleaned and recleaned in the endless cycle of military preparedness. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, the distant rumble of convoy vehicles provided a constant reminder that this was a place where peace was measured in hours rather than days. Inside the main command bunker, fluorescent lights cast their unforgiving glow across concrete walls lined with tactical maps, communication equipment, and the kind of military efficiency that looked impressive until something went wrong. The morning briefing room buzzed with the controlled chaos of soldiers preparing for operations that would either be routine or catastrophic, with very little middle ground between the two possibilities. Staff Sergeant Martinez shuffled through personnel rosters with the weary efficiency of someone who had processed thousands of deployment assignments and had learned not to expect surprises. His coffee mug, emblazoned with the faded logo of a unit that had been deactivated 3 years earlier, sat next to a stack of forms that represented the bureaucratic backbone of military operations. The kind of paperwork that kept armies functioning but rarely made it into the stories soldiers told when they returned home. The morning replacement cycle was running behind schedule, which meant everyone was operating on less sleep and more caffeine than optimal. Fresh faces mixed with veterans who had seen too many rotations, creating the volatile combination of inexperience and exhaustion that made forward operating bases particularly dangerous during transition periods. Someone had spilled instant coffee across the assignment board, leaving brown stains that made certain unit designations illegible. That's when she walked through the reinforced doors of the command bunker with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she knew exactly where she was going, even if nobody else did. Dr. Elena Vasquez moved through the maze of military personnel with an economy of motion that spoke to genuine experience rather than practiced confidence. Mid-30s, with the lean build of someone who stayed in peak physical condition, not for vanity, but for survival. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun that managed to look both professional and practical, secured with the kind of hair ties that wouldn't break under pressure. Her medical fatigues were standard issue, but showed the signs of extensive field use. The fabric was soft at the stress points, suggesting countless hours of wear in environments where comfort was secondary to function. Her boots carried the scuffed patina of someone who had walked through places where medical personnel weren't supposed to go, but often had to anyway. The medical bag she carried was larger than standard issue, packed with equipment that most field medics never saw outside of training scenarios. Everything about her appearance was carefully calibrated to blend into the background of military routine while carrying the tools necessary for situations that fell outside normal parameters. Her medical insignia was properly positioned, her uniform was within regulation, and her bearing suggested competence without calling attention to itself. She was the kind of person who could stand in a room full of soldiers and be cataloged as support personnel rather than someone whose presence might fundamentally alter the dynamics of any operation. Staff Sergeant Martinez glanced up from his roster when she approached his processing station, his expression carrying the particular brand of impatience that came from dealing with personnel issues before his second cup of coffee. The nameplate on his desk identified him as the kind of non-commissioned officer who had built his career on following procedures and avoiding complications that might reflect poorly on his efficiency ratings. "Name and unit designation," he said, fingers already positioned over keys that had seen better decades and probably processed more personnel than most small towns had residents. His tone carried the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned that treating everyone with equal indifference was the safest approach to military bureaucracy. Elena placed her deployment orders on the desk with movements that were precise without being military crisp. The documents were standard issue, printed on the kind of paper that was designed to survive field conditions while maintaining legibility. Her photograph showed the same composed expression she wore in person, the kind of professional neutrality that most people associated with medical personnel who had learned to compartmentalize emotional responses to human suffering. Dr. Elena Vasquez, Medical Corps, attached to Alpha Company for forward deployment, she said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had delivered information under pressure and expected it to be processed efficiently. Martinez fed her orders into his scanner, which made the tired electronic sounds of government equipment that had been maintained by the lowest bidder. The machine rejected her paperwork twice before finally accepting it with a green light that flickered uncertainly, as if it wasn't entirely confident in its own assessment. He squinted at his monitor with the expression of someone who had learned to distrust technology while being completely dependent on it. "Medical personnel are assigned to rear support positions," he said, highlighting a section of his screen with movements that suggested he had explained this policy countless times before. "Field medics get attached to specific units, but doctors stay in the medical tent unless there's a mass casualty event. Standard operating procedure." Elena nodded with the patience of someone who had expected this conversation and had prepared for it accordingly. "I understand the standard protocol. My orders indicate forward deployment with Alpha Company for specialized medical support." Behind her in the processing queue, a cluster of soldiers had begun to take notice of the exchange. Not because anything particularly dramatic was happening, but because the routine of deployment processing was mind-numbingly predictable, and any deviation from the script provided entertainment value that was otherwise lacking in military bureaucracy. Corporal Jackson, a 24-year-old from Detroit who had been deployed twice and considered himself a veteran of military politics, leaned toward his buddy with the kind of stage whisper that was designed to be overheard. "$10 says, she's never been outside the wire. Look at those hands. No calluses, no scars." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Probably thinks combat medicine means dealing with training accidents. Private Morrison, fresh from advanced individual training and still young enough to mistake cynicism for wisdom, grinned back with the enthusiasm of someone who had found his entertainment for the morning. 20 says she asks for a helicopter evacuation the first time she hears incoming artillery. These medical types always think they're ready for the field until they realize bullets don't care about your bedside manner. From the equipment check station, Sergeant First Class Peterson emerged with the casual authority of someone who had figured out that being a senior non-commissioned officer meant never having to admit uncertainty. Late 30s with the kind of weathered face that came from multiple deployments and the particular stress of being responsible for other people's survival. His uniform was perfectly maintained, his equipment was regulation plus, and his expression suggested that he had found something mildly amusing in the morning's routine. "Hope she brought comfortable shoes," he announced to no one in particular, his voice carrying clearly across the processing area. These medical officers always show up with running shoes and energy bars, thinking deployment is like a camping trip with better equipment. The laughter that followed had the particular edge that came when people used humor to process anxiety about situations they couldn't control. Not cruel enough to be formally problematic, but sharp enough to establish social hierarchies and remind everyone that military life was fundamentally about sorting people into categories of useful and liability. Elena accepted her process deployment orders from Martinez, who had managed to complete the paperwork while maintaining his expression of bureaucratic superiority. She folded the documents with the same methodical precision she had shown throughout the interaction and secured them in her cargo pocket with movements that suggested she had done this before. Forward deployment means you'll be attached to Alpha Company during patrol operations, Martinez explained, his tone carrying the particular brand of condescension that military personnel reserved for people they considered insufficiently prepared for reality. That's actual combat zones, not the nice clean medical facilities you're probably used to. Things get messy out there. Elena nodded once, acknowledging the information without rising to the implied challenge. No defensive explanations, no attempts to prove her qualifications, no visible reaction to the commentary flowing around her like water on a stone. She simply gathered her gear and moved toward the personnel assembly area where Alpha Company was preparing for their morning briefing. The assembly area was a converted storage space that had been repurposed for military meetings, complete with folding chairs that had seen better decades and a projection screen that required percussive maintenance to display images clearly. The walls were lined with tactical maps, communication protocols, and the kind of motivational posters that had been designed by people who had never actually served in combat zones. Alpha Company was a mixed unit of veterans and newer personnel, the kind of combination that either produced exceptional results or catastrophic failures depending on leadership and circumstances. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the unit's senior non-commissioned officer, was reviewing patrol routes with the methodical attention of someone who understood that small mistakes in planning could result in large consequences in execution. When Elena entered the assembly area, conversations didn't stop, but they shifted in the way that military personnel have learned to acknowledge new additions to their operational environment. She found a position near the back of the room, close enough to participate in briefings, but far enough from the command structure to avoid accidentally inserting herself into established hierarchies. Lieutenant Collins, Alpha Company's commanding officer, was 26 years old with the kind of confidence that came from excelling in controlled environments and hoping that those skills would translate to situations where the rules changed without notice. His uniform was regulation perfect, his equipment was arranged with mathematical precision, and his briefing materials were organized with the kind of attention to detail that suggested he had spent considerable time preparing for this moment. "We've got a new addition to the team," he announced, gesturing toward Elena with the casual authority of someone who had learned to treat personnel assignments as logistical challenges rather than human complications. Dr. Vasquez will be providing medical support for our forward operations. I assume everyone understands the importance of keeping our medical personnel safe and effective. The response was a chorus of acknowledgments that sounded professional, without being particularly enthusiastic. Military personnel had learned to accept personnel changes as inevitable, while maintaining emotional distance from people who might not be part of the unit long enough to justify personal investment. Specialist Williams, a medic with 2 years of deployment experience, looked up from his equipment check with the expression of someone who had just realized his workload was about to become more complicated. "Ma'am, I've got the standard field medical kit configured for patrol operations. If you need anything specific, you should probably let me know now so I can adjust the supply requisition." Elena nodded appreciatively, recognizing both the practical concern and the subtle assertion of territorial boundaries that came with military specialization. "I have my own equipment configured for field conditions. I won't need to modify your standard loadout." The answer seemed to satisfy Williams, who returned to his equipment check with the relief of someone who had been prepared for a much more complicated conversation. Military personnel had learned to appreciate colleagues who didn't create additional complications in situations that were already sufficiently challenging. Captain Morrison, the base medical officer, entered the assembly area with the hurried efficiency of someone who had been pulled away from other duties to handle what was probably a routine administrative matter. Mid-40s with the kind of clinical bearing that suggested he had spent more time in hospitals than combat zones, though his deployment record indicated he had served competently in both environments. "Dr. Vasquez," he said, approaching with the professional courtesy that medical personnel maintained regardless of military rank or deployment status. "I wanted to brief you on our standard protocols for forward medical support. We've got a well-established system that has kept casualty rates manageable, and I want to make sure we're all operating from the same playbook." Elena turned to face him with the respectful attention that medical professionals showed to colleagues, regardless of their opinion of those colleagues' competence. "I appreciate the briefing, Captain. I'm familiar with standard forward medical protocols, but I'm always interested in unit-specific modifications that improve effectiveness." Morrison nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had been prepared for resistance and was pleased to encounter professionalism instead. The key thing to remember is that forward medical support means stabilization and evacuation. We don't attempt complex procedures in the field because we don't have the resources or the controlled environment necessary for anything beyond basic trauma response. The explanation was delivered with the kind of careful emphasis that suggested Morrison had dealt with medical personnel who had overestimated their capabilities in field conditions. Military medicine was fundamentally different from civilian practice, and the transition often proved more challenging than people anticipated. "Our standard protocol is to establish a secure medical station approximately 200 meters behind the forward elements," Morrison continued, warming to his subject with the enthusiasm of someone who had spent considerable time developing these procedures. "Close enough to provide rapid response, far enough back to avoid becoming a casualty yourself. We found that medical personnel who try to keep up with the infantry usually end up requiring medical attention themselves." Elena listened with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was cataloging information rather than simply waiting for her turn to speak. No interruptions, no defensive responses, no attempts to prove her qualifications through verbal sparring. She simply processed the information and filed it away for future reference. "I understand the standard protocol," she said when Morrison finished his briefing. "My orders indicate integration with forward elements for specialized medical support. But I'm prepared to adapt based on operational requirements and unit preference." The response seemed to satisfy Morrison, who had been prepared for a much more complicated conversation with someone who might have unrealistic expectations about combat medicine. Military personnel had learned to appreciate colleagues who understood the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application. Lieutenant Collins cleared his throat with the particular sound that military officers made when they wanted to redirect attention to official business. "Alpha Company will be conducting a patrol operation this afternoon to establish contact with local tribal leaders and assess infrastructure needs in the Kandahar province. Standard hearts and minds mission with potential for hostile contact." The briefing that followed covered the kind of operational details that separated successful military units from casualties. Routes, communication protocols, contingency plans, and the endless variables that could transform a routine patrol into a life-or-death situation. Elena listened with the same focused attention she had shown throughout the morning, taking notes on a waterproof pad that looked more sophisticated than standard issue. Her questions were precise and relevant, focusing on medical evacuation procedures, communication protocols for medical emergencies, and the kind of practical details that suggested she understood the difference between theoretical planning and field reality. Nothing she asked revealed any particular specialized knowledge, but everything she asked indicated competence and preparation. When the briefing concluded, personnel began the familiar ritual of equipment checks and preparation that preceded every military operation. Alina moved through the process with the same methodical efficiency she had shown throughout the morning, checking her medical equipment with the kind of systematic attention that suggested this was routine rather than exceptional. Specialist Williams watched her organize her medical supplies with the professional curiosity of someone who had learned to evaluate colleagues based on their practical competence rather than their credentials. That's a lot more gear than most medical personnel carry for patrol operations, he observed, his tone carefully neutral to avoid sounding either impressed or critical. Alina looked up from her equipment check with the kind of direct gaze that most people found slightly uncomfortable. I prefer to be prepared for situations that fall outside normal parameters. It's easier to carry extra equipment than to need something you don't have. The answer made sense from a practical standpoint, though it raised questions about what kind of situation she was preparing for. Military personnel had learned to be suspicious of colleagues who seemed to know more about potential problems than their official briefings suggested they should. As Alpha Company prepared for their afternoon patrol, Alina completed her equipment check with the same quiet efficiency she had shown throughout the morning. Her medical bag was organized with surgical precision, every item in its designated place, every tool configured for immediate use. The kind of preparation that suggested she had packed this equipment many times before and had learned through experience what worked and what didn't. When the call came for personnel to move to the vehicle staging area, Alina shouldered her gear with the practiced ease of someone who had carried military equipment through challenging terrain. No fumbling with straps, no last-minute adjustments, no visible signs of uncertainty about what she was about to face. She simply gathered her equipment and moved toward the door, with the same purposeful stride she had shown since arriving at the base. The vehicle staging area was a controlled chaos of military personnel preparing for operations that could range from routine to catastrophic. Humvees were loaded with equipment, weapons were checked and rechecked, and soldiers went through the familiar rituals that helped them process the anxiety of heading into situations where preparation mattered more than hope. Alina approached the vehicle she had been assigned to with the same calm efficiency she had shown throughout the day. No visible nervousness, no attempts to engage in the kind of pre-mission banter that most people use to manage stress. She simply took her assigned position and waited for the operation to begin. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been observing the new addition to his unit with the careful attention of someone responsible for everyone's survival, made his final equipment check with the thoroughness of someone who had learned that small oversights could produce large consequences. Alina's presence didn't seem to concern him, but it also didn't seem to inspire particular confidence. "Doc," he said, approaching with the professional courtesy that military personnel maintained regardless of their personal opinions. "This is your first patrol with Alpha Company. Any questions about our procedures or anything you need clarified before we move out?" Alina looked up from her equipment check with the kind of direct attention that suggested she had been waiting for this conversation. "I understand the mission parameters and my role in the operation. I'm prepared to provide medical support as needed and to follow unit protocols for movement and communication." Rodriguez nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had been prepared for complications and was pleased to encounter professionalism instead. "Good. Stay close to Williams until you get a feel for how we operate. Combat medicine is different from anything you've probably experienced, and we want to make sure everyone gets home safely." The engine started with the particular roar of military vehicles that had been maintained by necessity rather than preference. Alina secured her equipment with the kind of systematic attention that suggested she had done this before, though nothing in her official record indicated prior deployment experience. Her movements were efficient without being rushed, competent without being showy. As Alpha Company moved out for their patrol operation, Elena settled into her position with the calm focus of someone who is prepared for whatever they might encounter. No visible anxiety, no last-minute doubts, no attempts to prove herself through unnecessary conversation. She simply watched the landscape roll past through armored windows and waited for the moment when her presence would either prove valuable or become a liability. The patrol route took them through terrain that had been contested for generations, where every ridge and valley held the potential for either peaceful contact or lethal encounter. Elena observed the landscape with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was reading information most people missed, cataloging details that might prove important later. When they reached their first checkpoint, Alpha Company established a security perimeter with the practiced efficiency of a unit that had learned to balance caution with operational necessity. Elena took her assigned position within the perimeter, close enough to provide immediate medical response, but far enough from the forward elements to avoid becoming a casualty herself. The local tribal leaders they were supposed to meet had not yet arrived, which meant the unit settled into the familiar routine of waiting while maintaining full combat readiness. Elena used the time to survey the area with the kind of systematic attention that suggested she was looking for something specific, though she didn't share her observations with anyone else. That's when the first shots rang out from the ridgeline above their position, and everything changed in the space of a heartbeat. Alpha Company responded with the trained efficiency of soldiers who had prepared for this moment, but Elena's response was something entirely different, something that made everyone who witnessed it realize they had completely misjudged who they were dealing with. The Taliban fighters had chosen their position well, using the high ground and natural cover to maximize their tactical advantage while minimizing their exposure to return fire. Their initial volley was designed to pin down Alpha Company while additional fighters moved to flanking positions that would allow them to overwhelm the American position through superior numbers and positioning. Elena moved the moment she heard the first shot, not toward cover like everyone expected, but toward the sound of gunfire with the kind of purposeful advance that suggested she had been waiting for this moment. Her medical bag was secured across her body, but her hands were free, and her movement was nothing like the careful positioning that medical personnel were trained to adopt in combat situations. Specialist Williams, who had been assigned to keep her safe, found himself struggling to keep up with her advance toward the most dangerous part of the battlefield. "Doc, we need to establish a medical station in the rear," he shouted over the sound of gunfire, his voice carrying the particular strain of someone who was trying to follow protocols while dealing with a situation that didn't match his training. Elena didn't respond to his call, but she didn't ignore it either. She simply continued her advance toward the forward elements of Alpha Company, where the heaviest fighting was concentrated. Her movement was fluid and purposeful, nothing like the careful positioning that medical personnel were trained to adopt in combat situations. When she reached the forward position where Lieutenant Collins was coordinating the unit's response to the attack, Elena took a position that provided her with clear sight lines to the entire battlefield. Not the protected position that medical personnel were supposed to occupy, but a tactical position that allowed her to observe and respond to developments across the entire operational area. "Dr. Vasquez, you need to move to a secure position," Collins shouted, his voice carrying the particular urgency of someone who was trying to manage multiple crises simultaneously. Medical personnel are not supposed to be in the forward positions during active combat. Elena looked at him with the kind of direct gaze that cut through the chaos of combat and made him suddenly aware that he might be operating under incorrect assumptions about who he was dealing with. "Lieutenant, I need you to trust me for the next few minutes. Can you do that?" The question was delivered with the kind of calm authority that made Collins realize he was no longer the senior decision-maker in this situation. Elena's voice carried the particular quality of someone who had been in command during life or death situations and expected to be obeyed without question. Before Collins could respond, Elena had moved again, this time toward a position that provided her with direct access to the Taliban fighters' most likely approach routes. Her movement was nothing like the careful positioning that medical personnel were trained to adopt, and everything like the tactical advancement of someone who had extensive combat experience. That's when she reached for her dog tags with movements that were precise and deliberate, as if she was activating something that had been dormant for years. The tags themselves looked standard issue from a distance, but when Collins caught a glimpse of them, he realized they carried classifications that made his own security clearance look like public information. The identification information was partially obscured by wear and intentional modification, but the classification markings were clear enough to make his hands shake as he processed what he was seeing. Black Ops Classified, Special Operations Command. Authorization codes that existed in databases he didn't have access to and wouldn't have understood if he did. Elena wasn't just a medical officer who had been assigned to provide forward support. She was something that existed in the spaces between official recognition and necessary action. Someone whose service record was maintained in archives that officially didn't exist, whose capabilities were classified at levels that made normal military operations look like public information. The dog tags didn't just identify her as medical personnel. They identified her as someone whose medical training had been combined with operational capabilities that fell outside normal military categories. Someone who could provide medical support in situations where traditional medical personnel couldn't survive, let alone function effectively. As Taliban fighters began their flanking maneuver, Elena moved with the kind of tactical precision that made everyone who witnessed it realize they had completely misjudged who they were dealing with. Her advance wasn't the careful positioning of someone trying to avoid combat, but the purposeful movement of someone who had been trained to engage in combat while maintaining her primary medical responsibilities. The transformation was complete and undeniable. The quiet medical officer who had been dismissed as inexperienced had revealed herself to be someone whose capabilities exceeded everyone's understanding of what was possible. Someone whose presence would fundamentally alter the outcome of this engagement in ways that nobody could have anticipated. Alpha Company was about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who appear to be the least threatening, and that medical personnel who carried Black Ops classifications were prepared to save lives through methods that fell well outside traditional medical practice. The first casualty came within seconds of the initial volley. Private Henderson, positioned at the eastern edge of their perimeter, took a round through his shoulder that spun him backward into the rocky outcropping he'd been using for cover. The impact sent him sprawling, his weapon clattering across the stone surface as blood began to pool beneath him. "Man down!" Specialist Williams shouted, his voice carrying the particular urgency of someone who had been trained to respond to combat casualties, but had never quite gotten used to the reality of it. He began moving toward Henderson's position with his standard medical kit, following the protocols that had been drilled into him during countless training exercises. Elena was already moving before Williams had finished his call. Not toward Henderson's position like everyone expected, but toward a cluster of boulders that provided overlapping fields of fire across the entire engagement area. Her movement was fluid and purposeful, nothing like the careful positioning that medical personnel were trained to adopt in combat situations. She reached Henderson's position a full 10 seconds before Williams, despite having started from a position that should have made her arrival impossible. When Williams finally reached them, he found Elena had already begun treatment that went far beyond standard field medicine protocols. Henderson's wound was more complex than it initially appeared. The bullet had entered through his shoulder, but had fragmented against his body armor, creating multiple wound channels that required immediate surgical intervention to prevent fatal blood loss. Standard field medical protocol called for pressure bandages and rapid evacuation to a proper medical facility. Elena had opened Henderson's uniform with movements that were surgical in their precision, revealing the full extent of his injuries. Within seconds of arrival, her assessment was rapid and comprehensive, the kind of clinical evaluation that required years of trauma experience to perform under combat conditions. "Williams, I need you to maintain pressure on the primary wound site while I address the secondary bleeding," she said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had performed this procedure countless times before. "Apply steady pressure. Don't try to stop the bleeding completely. Just slow it down while I work." Williams followed her instructions with the automatic obedience of someone who had recognized genuine expertise, but his expression reflected the confusion of someone who was witnessing medical procedures that exceeded his understanding of what was possible in field conditions. Elena's hands moved with surgical precision as she worked to control Henderson's bleeding. Not the basic trauma response that field medics were trained to provide, but advanced surgical techniques that required specialized equipment and extensive training to perform safely. She produced instruments from her medical kit that Williams had never seen before. Not standard issue field medical equipment, but specialized surgical tools that looked like they belonged in an operating theater rather than a combat zone. Each tool was precisely positioned, immediately accessible, and configured for use in conditions that would challenge even experienced trauma surgeons. "Doc, what are you doing?" Williams asked, his voice carrying the particular strain of someone who was trying to process information that didn't fit any category he understood. "This isn't standard field medical protocol. We're supposed to stabilize and evacuate, not perform surgery in a combat zone." Elena looked up from her work with the kind of direct gaze that cut through confusion and established immediate understanding. "Henderson has approximately 4 minutes before he enters irreversible shock. Evacuation will take at least 20 minutes under current conditions. Which approach do you think gives him the best chance of survival?" The question was delivered with the kind of clinical precision that made Williams realize he was no longer the senior medical authority in this situation. Elena's voice carried the particular quality of someone who had made these calculations countless times before and had learned to trust her assessment over established protocols. While Elena worked on Henderson, the firefight continued to intensify around them. Taliban fighters had successfully established positions on 2 sides of Alpha Company's perimeter, creating a crossfire that pinned down most of the unit while allowing enemy forces to advance on their flanks. Lieutenant Collins was coordinating the unit's response from a position that provided him with clear sight lines to most of the battlefield, but the tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. His radio crackled with updates from his squad leaders that painted a picture of increasing enemy pressure and decreasing ammunition reserves. "Alpha 6, this is Alpha 2. We've got movement on the northern approach. Looks like they're trying to flank us from the high ground. Request permission to reposition to counter the threat." Collins keyed his radio with the particular urgency of someone who was trying to manage multiple crises simultaneously. "Alpha 2, negative on the repositioning. Hold your current position and maintain suppressive fire. We can't afford to give them any more ground." The response came back immediately, carrying the strain of soldiers who were dealing with a situation that was rapidly moving beyond their ability to control. "Alpha 6, we're taking heavy fire from multiple directions. Our current position is becoming untenable. We need to either advance or withdraw before they complete their encirclement." Elena had been listening to the radio traffic while continuing her work on Henderson, her attention divided between the immediate medical crisis and the larger tactical situation that was developing around them. Her expression suggested she was processing information that went beyond standard medical concerns. "Lieutenant Collins," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the engagement area despite the ongoing gunfire. I need you to hold this position for approximately 6 more minutes. Can you do that? Collins looked toward her position with the expression of someone who is trying to process multiple competing priorities simultaneously. Doc, we're not in a position to hold anything right now. The tactical situation is deteriorating rapidly, and we need to consider withdrawal to a more defensible position. Elena's response was delivered with the kind of calm authority that made Collins realize he might be operating under incorrect assumptions about the scope of her responsibilities. 6 minutes, Lieutenant. After that, the tactical situation will change significantly. The statement was delivered with such confidence that Collins found himself agreeing before he fully understood what he was committing to. Elena's voice carried the particular quality of someone who had been in command during life-or-death situations and expected to be obeyed without question. Elena returned her attention to Henderson, whose condition had stabilized under her treatment, but still required immediate surgical intervention to prevent complications. The procedure she was performing went far beyond anything that Williams had seen in his medical training, but they were producing results that exceeded his understanding of what was possible in field conditions. Williams, I need you to prepare a surgical field using the equipment in the secondary compartment of my medical kit, she said, her instructions delivered with the kind of clinical precision that suggested she had performed this procedure many times before. Full sterile protocols, despite the environmental conditions. Henderson's going to need immediate surgery if we're going to save his life. Williams opened the secondary compartment of Elena's medical kit with movements that were careful and deliberate, knowing that he was about to discover equipment that would challenge his understanding of what medical personnel carried in combat zones. What he found exceeded his expectations in ways that raised questions about who Elena really was and what kind of operations she had been prepared to support. The surgical instruments were military specification, but far more advanced than anything he had seen in standard field medical kits. Precision tools that looked like they belonged in a specialized trauma center rather than a combat zone. Each instrument was perfectly maintained, immediately accessible, and configured for use in conditions that would challenge even experienced surgeons. Elena began Henderson's surgery with movements that were fluid and confident, the kind of technical competence that required years of trauma experience to develop. Her hands moved with surgical precision as she addressed the complex wound channels that the fragmented bullet had created, working to repair damage that would have required multiple specialists in a proper medical facility. The procedure was advanced enough that Williams found himself struggling to follow her technique, despite having received extensive training in combat medicine. Elena was performing surgical interventions that exceeded his understanding of what was possible in field conditions, using equipment that surpassed his knowledge of standard medical capabilities. While Elena worked, the tactical situation continued to deteriorate around them. Taliban fighters had successfully established positions that allowed them to maintain suppressive fire while advancing on Alpha Company's flanks. The crossfire was becoming more intense, and Collins' squad leaders were reporting ammunition shortages that suggested the unit's ability to maintain their position was rapidly approaching its limits. Alpha 6, this is Alpha 3. We're down to our last magazines and enemy pressure is increasing. We need immediate resupply or permission to withdraw to a more defensible position. Collins keyed his radio with the particular urgency of someone who is trying to balance multiple competing priorities. Alpha 3, understood. Hold your position and conserve ammunition. Help is coming. The response was delivered with more confidence than Collins actually felt, but military leadership often required projecting certainty in situations where certainty was impossible. Elena had asked for 6 minutes, and he was prepared to provide them, despite not understanding what would happen when that time expired. Elena was working on Henderson with the kind of focused concentration that suggested she was performing procedures that required her complete attention. Her surgical technique was flawless, Her instrument handling was precise, and her clinical assessment was comprehensive. Everything about her work suggested extensive experience in trauma surgery under challenging conditions. "Williams, I need you to monitor Henderson's vital signs while I address the secondary bleeding," she said, her instructions delivered with the kind of clinical authority that made Williams realize he was witnessing medical procedures that exceeded his training. "His blood pressure is stabilizing, but we need to maintain close observation to prevent complications." Williams positioned himself to monitor Henderson's condition while Elena continued her surgical work. The equipment she was using to track Henderson's vital signs was more advanced than anything he had seen in standard field medical kits, providing real-time data that would have been impossible to obtain in most combat situations. Elena's surgical procedure was proceeding with the kind of systematic precision that suggested she had performed this operation many times before. Her movements were efficient and purposeful, addressing each aspect of Henderson's injuries with the kind of clinical competence that required years of specialized training to develop. The gunfire around them was intensifying, but Elena's concentration remained absolute. She worked with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was accustomed to performing complex medical procedures under extreme conditions, where any mistake could result in immediate death. "Doc, how much longer?" Williams asked, his voice carrying the particular strain of someone who is trying to balance medical concerns with the tactical realities of their situation. "The firefight is getting more intense, and I'm not sure how much longer we can maintain this position." Elena looked up from her work with the kind of direct gaze that conveyed both assessment and reassurance. "2 more minutes for the primary repair, then Henderson will be stable enough for movement. After that, the tactical situation will change significantly." The statement was delivered with such confidence that Williams found himself believing her, despite not understanding what she meant by the tactical situation changing. Elena's voice carried the particular quality of someone who had been in similar situations before and had learned to trust her assessment over established protocols. Elena completed Henderson's surgery with movements that were precise and efficient, her technique flawless despite the challenging conditions. The results exceeded Williams' understanding of what was possible in field medical conditions, but Henderson's vital signs were stable, and his immediate survival was no longer in question. "Henderson's stable for movement," she announced, her voice carrying the clinical authority of someone who had made this assessment countless times before. "He'll need additional surgical intervention and a proper medical facility, but he's no longer in immediate danger." Williams looked at Henderson's condition with the expression of someone who was trying to process results that exceeded his understanding of field medical capabilities. Elena had performed surgical procedures that should have required a specialized trauma center, using equipment that surpassed his knowledge of standard medical resources. Elena began packing her surgical instruments with the same methodical precision she had shown throughout the procedure. Each tool was cleaned, secured, and positioned for immediate reuse if necessary. Her movements suggested that this was routine, rather than exceptional, the kind of post-procedure protocol that came from extensive experience in trauma surgery. "Williams, I need you to prepare Henderson for movement while I address the tactical situation," she said, her instructions delivered with the kind of calm authority that made Williams realize Elena's responsibilities extended beyond standard medical support. "Keep him stable and ready for evacuation, but don't begin movement until I give the signal." Williams nodded with the automatic obedience of someone who had recognized genuine expertise, but his expression reflected the confusion of someone who was witnessing procedures that exceeded his understanding of what medical personnel were authorized to do in combat situations. Elena stood up from Henderson's position with movements that were fluid and purposeful, her attention shifting from medical concerns to the tactical situation that was developing around them. Her assessment of the battlefield was rapid and comprehensive, the kind of tactical evaluation that required extensive combat experience to perform accurately. The Taliban fighters had successfully established positions that allowed them to maintain suppressive fire while advancing on Alpha Company's flanks. Their tactics were sound, their execution was competent, and their numerical advantage was beginning to tell. Collins' squad leaders were reporting ammunition shortages and increasing enemy pressure that suggested the unit's ability to maintain. Their position was rapidly approaching its limits. Alina moved toward Lieutenant Collins' position with the kind of purposeful advance that suggested she was prepared to provide assistance that went beyond standard medical support. Her movement was tactical rather than medical, the kind of battlefield positioning that required extensive combat training to perform safely. "Lieutenant Collins," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the engagement area despite the ongoing gunfire. "I need you to coordinate a concentrated fire mission on the northern approach in approximately 30 seconds. Can you do that?" Collins looked toward her position with the expression of someone who was trying to process instructions that came from an unexpected source. "Doc, I appreciate the tactical input, but medical personnel aren't authorized to direct combat operations. That's outside your area of responsibility." Elena's response was delivered with the kind of calm authority that made Collins realize he might be operating under incorrect assumptions about the scope of her authorization. "Lieutenant, I need you to trust my assessment for the next few minutes. The tactical situation is about to change in ways that will require coordinated response." The statement was delivered with such confidence that Collins found himself preparing to follow her instructions, despite not understanding the basis for her tactical knowledge. Elena's voice carried the particular quality of someone who had been in command during life-or-death situations and expected to be obeyed without question. Elena reached into her medical kit and produced equipment that Williams had never seen before. Not standard medical instruments, but specialized communication devices that looked like they belonged in a command and control center rather than a combat medic's kit. Each device was military specification, but far more advanced than anything he had seen in standard field equipment. She activated the communication equipment with movements that were precise and confident, the kind of technical competence that suggested she had used these devices many times before. The equipment responded immediately, establishing connections that provided her with real-time information about the tactical situation that exceeded what was available through standard military communications. "Overwatch, this is Nightingale. Request immediate tactical support for grid reference 41 SUB 23456789001. Authentication code Zulu 77 Alpha." The response came back immediately, carrying the kind of professional efficiency that suggested Elena was communicating with people who had been expecting her call. "Nightingale, this is Overwatch. Authentication confirmed. Tactical support inbound. 8 of 4 minutes. Designate targets for precision engagement." Elena's communication was delivered with the kind of calm authority that made everyone who overheard it realize they were witnessing coordination that exceeded standard military protocols. Her voice carried the particular quality of someone who had access to resources that fell outside normal operational channels. Williams looked at the communication equipment with the expression of someone who was trying to process information that challenged his understanding of what medical personnel were authorized to carry. Elena's gear was far more advanced than anything he had seen in standard field medical kits, suggesting capabilities that exceeded normal medical support roles. Elena began directing tactical information to her support element with the kind of precise coordination that suggested she had performed this function many times before. Her assessment of the battlefield was comprehensive and accurate, providing real-time intelligence that would allow for surgical strikes against enemy positions. Overwatch primary targets are located at grid references 41 SUB 23446, 78,911, and 41 SUB 23466, 78,891. Secondary targets are mobile and advancing on our flanks from the northwest approach. Request precision engagement to neutralize the threat without endangering friendly forces. The response was immediate and professional, carrying the kind of technical competence that suggested Alina was working with people who understood the operational requirements of precision targeting in complex tactical situations. Nightingale. Targets confirmed. Precision engagement authorized. Friendly forces maintain current positions for safety protocols. Alina turned to Lieutenant Collins with the kind of direct gaze that conveyed both authority and urgency. Lieutenant, I need all personnel to maintain their current positions for the next 2 minutes. No movement, no repositioning, no attempts to advance or withdraw. Can you coordinate that? Collins nodded with the automatic obedience of someone who had recognized that Alina possessed capabilities that exceeded his understanding of standard military operations. Understood, Doc. All units maintain current positions. No movement until further notice. The radio traffic that followed reflected the confusion of soldiers who were trying to process instructions that came from an unexpected source. But military training had taught them to follow orders from recognized authority figures, even when those orders challenged their understanding of normal protocols. Alina's communication equipment crackled with updates from her support element, providing real-time information about the precision engagement that was about to neutralize the Taliban fighters who had pinned down Alpha Company. Her coordination was flawless, her targeting was precise, and her tactical assessment was comprehensive. Overwatch, this is Nightingale. Friendly forces are secured in current positions. Authorization for precision engagement is confirmed. Execute. When ready. The response came back with the kind of professional efficiency that suggested Alina was working with people who had performed similar operations many times before. Nightingale, this is Overwatch. Precision engagement commencing in 10 seconds. Maintain friendly positions until all clear signal. Alina looked around the battlefield with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was tracking multiple variables simultaneously. Her assessment covered not just the immediate tactical situation, but the broader operational context that would determine the success of the precision engagement she had coordinated. The sound that followed was unlike anything Williams had heard before. Not the explosive detonation of artillery or the sharp crack of sniper fire, but something more surgical and precise. The Taliban positions were neutralized with the kind of clinical efficiency that suggested extremely advanced targeting capabilities. Within seconds, the suppressive fire that had pinned down Alpha Company ceased completely. The crossfire that had been intensifying throughout the engagement was eliminated with surgical precision, leaving only the echo of precision strikes that had removed the threat without endangering friendly forces. Alina's communication equipment crackled with confirmation from her support element, providing real-time assessment of the engagement results. Nightingale, this is Overwatch. Precision. Engagement successful. All primary and secondary targets neutralized. Friendly forces are clear to resume operations. Alina turned to Lieutenant Collins with the kind of direct gaze that conveyed both satisfaction and professional competence. Lieutenant, the tactical situation has been resolved. Your unit is clear to resume normal operations. Collins looked around the battlefield with the expression of someone who was trying to process results that exceeded his understanding of what was possible through standard military coordination. The Taliban fighters who had pinned down his unit had been eliminated with surgical precision, using resources that appeared to exceed normal operational capabilities. Doc, what the hell just happened? Collins asked, his voice carrying the particular strain of someone who was trying to balance gratitude with confusion about procedures that fell outside his operational experience. That wasn't standard medical support. That was advanced tactical coordination with resources I don't recognize. Elena looked at him with the kind of direct gaze that conveyed both understanding and the need for operational security. Lieutenant, sometimes medical personnel are authorized to provide support that exceeds standard protocols. The important thing is that your unit is secure and can continue its mission. The explanation was delivered with the kind of calm authority that made Collins realize he was dealing with someone whose authorization exceeded his understanding of standard military operations. Elena's voice carried the particular quality of someone who had been in similar situations before and had learned to balance operational requirements with security concerns. Elena returned to Henderson's position where Williams was monitoring his condition with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was trying to process multiple competing priorities simultaneously. Henderson's vital signs were stable, his surgical wounds were healing properly, and his immediate survival was no longer in question. Williams, Henderson's ready for movement to a proper medical facility, Elena said, her voice carrying the clinical authority of someone who had made this assessment countless times before. His condition is stable, but he'll need additional surgical intervention to prevent complications. Williams looked at Henderson's condition with the expression of someone who was trying to process results that exceeded his understanding of field medical capabilities. Elena had performed surgical procedures that should have required a specialized trauma center and had coordinated tactical support that exceeded normal medical authorization. "Doc, I need to ask," Williams said, his voice carrying the particular strain of someone who was trying to balance curiosity with operational security requirements. "What kind of medical training authorizes the procedures you just performed? And what kind of medical equipment includes tactical coordination capabilities?" Elena looked at him with the kind of direct gaze that conveyed both understanding and the need for discretion. "Williams, sometimes medical personnel receive training that exceeds standard protocols. The important thing is that Henderson is alive and your unit completed its mission successfully." The explanation was delivered with the kind of calm authority that made Williams realize he was dealing with someone whose capabilities exceeded his understanding of standard military medical operations. Elena's voice carried the particular quality of someone who had been in similar situations before and had learned to balance operational requirements with security concerns. Elena began packing her equipment with the same methodical precision she had shown throughout the engagement. Each piece of gear was cleaned, secured, and positioned for immediate reuse if necessary. Her movements suggested that this was routine, rather than exceptional, the kind of post-operation protocol that came from extensive experience in complex tactical situations. Alpha Company began the process of consolidating their position and preparing for extraction with the kind of systematic efficiency that came from completing a successful operation under challenging conditions. The tactical situation had been resolved, casualties had been minimized, and the mission objectives had been achieved. Elena stood apart from the main group, monitoring her communication equipment with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was tracking multiple variables simultaneously. Her assessment covered not just the immediate aftermath of the engagement, but the broader operational context that would determine the success of future missions. Lieutenant Collins approached her position with the kind of respectful attention that suggested he had gained significant appreciation for her capabilities during the engagement. "Doc, I need to file an after-action report on what happened here. Today, I'm not sure how to categorize the support you provided." Elena looked at him with the kind of direct gaze that conveyed both understanding and the need for operational security. "Lieutenant, medical personnel provided forward support. That enabled mission success. The specific procedures and coordination methods are classified at levels that exceed standard reporting requirements." The explanation was delivered with the kind of calm authority that made Collins realize he was dealing with someone whose operations fell outside normal military categories. Elena's voice carried the particular quality of someone who had been in similar situations before and had learned to balance operational success with security requirements. Elena's communication equipment crackled with updates from her support element, providing real-time information about the broader operational context that surrounded Alpha Company's mission. Her coordination was ongoing, her assessment was comprehensive, and her responsibilities extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. Overwatch, this is Nightingale. Local tactical situation resolved successfully. Friendly casualties minimized, mission objectives achieved. Request status update on broader operational context. The response came back with the kind of professional efficiency that suggested Elena was part of a larger operational framework that exceeded standard military coordination. Nightingale, this is Overwatch. Broader operational context remains stable. Continue mission support as required. Excellent work on tactical coordination. Elena looked around the battlefield with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was cataloging information for future reference. Her assessment covered not just the immediate results of the engagement, but the broader lessons that could be applied to future operations in similar tactical situations. The helicopter extraction arrived within minutes of Elena's coordination, providing rapid medical evacuation for Henderson and extraction for Alpha Company. The coordination was flawless, the timing was precise, and the execution exceeded standard military efficiency. Elena supervised Henderson's transfer to the medical evacuation helicopter with the kind of clinical attention that suggested she was maintaining responsibility for his care throughout the evacuation process. Her coordination with the flight medics was professional and comprehensive, ensuring continuity of care that would maximize Henderson's chances of complete recovery. As Alpha Company prepared for extraction, Elena conducted a final equipment check with the same methodical precision she had shown throughout the engagement. Each piece of gear was accounted for, secured, and positioned for immediate reuse if necessary. Her movements suggested that this was routine rather than exceptional, the kind of post-operation protocol that came from extensive experience in complex tactical situations. Williams watched Elena's final preparations with the expression of someone who was trying to process experiences that exceeded his understanding of what was possible through standard military operations. Elena had demonstrated capabilities that challenged his assumptions about medical personnel, tactical coordination, and the resources available to support forward operations. "Doc, I've got to ask one more time," Williams said, his voice carrying the particular strain of someone who was trying to balance curiosity with respect for operational security. "What kind of medical training includes tactical coordination and precision targeting capabilities?" Elena looked at him with the kind of direct gaze that conveyed both understanding and finality. "Williams, sometimes the people who save lives are authorized to use methods that exceed standard protocols. The important thing is that everyone goes home safely." The explanation was delivered with the kind of calm authority that made Williams realize he had witnessed something that fell outside normal military categories. Elena's voice carried the particular quality of someone who had been in similar situations before and had learned to balance operational success with necessary discretion. Elena moved toward the extraction helicopter with the same purposeful stride she had shown throughout the engagement. Her movement was confident and efficient, suggesting that helicopter extractions were routine rather than exceptional experiences for her. As the helicopter lifted off from the battlefield, Elena looked down at the tactical situation they were leaving behind. The Taliban fighters had been neutralized with surgical precision. Alpha Company had completed their mission successfully, and Henderson was receiving the medical care that would ensure his complete recovery. The engagement had demonstrated Elena's capabilities in ways that exceeded everyone's expectations, but had also raised questions about her authorization, her training, and her operational responsibilities that would likely never be fully answered. Through normal channels, Elena's dog tags, still visible against her uniform, caught the light from the helicopter's interior lighting. The classification markings were clear enough to read, but their implications were complex enough to challenge. Standard understanding of military operations and medical support. Black Ops Classified, Special Operations Command. Authorization codes that existed in databases that most military personnel would never access, representing capabilities that fell outside normal operational categories. Elena had proven that. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who appear to be the least threatening, and that medical personnel who carried Black Ops classifications were prepared to save lives through methods that exceeded standard medical practice. Alpha Company would return to base with a successful mission, minimal casualties, and questions about the medical officer who had provided support that exceeded their understanding of what was possible. Elena would continue her deployment, ready for the next situation that required her unique combination of medical expertise and tactical capabilities. The helicopter carried them back toward base, where Elena would resume her role as a medical officer assigned to provide forward support. But everyone who had witnessed her performance during the engagement would remember that appearances could be deceiving, and that the quiet professionals who served without recognition often possessed capabilities that exceeded their official job descriptions. Elena's medical bag sat secured beside her, containing equipment that exceeded standard field medical kits and represented capabilities that fell outside normal medical practice. Her communication equipment was powered down, but ready for immediate activation, maintaining connection to support elements that operated beyond standard military coordination. The engagement had been resolved successfully, but Elena knew that similar situations would arise in the future. Her deployment would continue, her responsibilities would expand, and her capabilities would be tested in ways that would challenge her training and experience. But for now, Henderson was stable, Alpha Company was secure, and the mission had been completed with minimal casualties. Elena had proven that medical personnel with Black Ops classifications were prepared to provide support that exceeded standard protocols, using methods that fell outside normal medical practice. The helicopter approached the base, where Elena would resume her official role as a medical officer assigned to provide forward support. But everyone who had witnessed her performance would remember that sometimes the most important people in military operations were the ones whose capabilities exceeded their job descriptions, and whose service could only be measured by the lives they saved and the missions they made possible. The debriefing room at Forward Operating Base Crimson felt different when Elena walked in 3 hours after the helicopter extraction. The same fluorescent lights cast their harsh institutional glow across the same concrete walls, but the atmosphere had shifted in ways that made everyone suddenly aware they were in the presence of someone whose capabilities exceeded their previous understanding. Colonel Martinez sat behind a metal desk that had seen better decades, surrounded by the kind of military efficiency that looked impressive until someone like Elena demonstrated what real competence looked like. His expression carried the particular strain of someone who had spent the afternoon trying to process after-action reports that challenged his understanding of standard operating procedures. The preliminary reports from Alpha Company's engagement had created more questions than answers. Lieutenant Collins had filed documentation that described medical support that exceeded standard protocols, tactical coordination that involved resources he couldn't identify, and precision targeting that had resolved a deteriorating tactical situation with surgical efficiency. Elena entered the debriefing room with the same purposeful stride she had shown throughout her deployment, but now everyone who saw her move understood they were watching someone whose training extended far beyond standard medical practice. Her uniform was regulation clean, her equipment was properly secured, and her bearing suggested professional competence that transcended normal military categories. "Dr. Vasquez," Colonel Martinez said, his voice carrying the particular formality that senior officers used when they encountered situations that exceeded their operational experience. Please have a seat. We need to discuss what happened during Alpha Company's patrol operation. Elena took the offered chair with movements that were precise and deliberate, her posture suggesting someone who was comfortable in briefing rooms, but had learned to maintain operational security regardless of the circumstances. Her medical bag was positioned beside her chair, containing equipment that everyone now understood exceeded standard field medical kits. Colonel, Alpha Company completed their mission successfully with minimal casualties, Elena said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had learned to focus on results rather than methods. Private Henderson is stable and receiving appropriate medical care. The tactical situation was resolved without loss of life among friendly forces. Martinez looked at the reports spread across his desk with the expression of someone who was trying to reconcile official documentation with witness statements that challenged his understanding of what was possible through standard military operations. Dr. Vasquez, according to these reports, you performed surgical procedures that exceed standard field medical protocols and coordinated tactical support that involved resources not listed in our operational database. Elena met his gaze with the kind of direct attention that conveyed both respect for his authority and confidence in her own operational legitimacy. Colonel, medical personnel are sometimes authorized to provide support that exceeds standard protocols when operational requirements demand enhanced capabilities. The explanation was delivered with the kind of professional courtesy that made Martinez realize he was dealing with someone whose authorization exceeded his understanding of normal military medical operations. Elena's voice carried the particular quality of someone who had been in similar briefings before and had learned to balance operational security with necessary explanation. Captain Morrison entered the debriefing room with the hurried efficiency of someone who had been reviewing medical documentation that challenged his understanding of what was possible in field conditions. His expression reflected the confusion of someone who had spent years working within established protocols only to discover that some personnel operated under different rules entirely. Dr. Vasquez, Morrison said, approaching with the professional courtesy that medical personnel maintained regardless of rank or operational confusion. I've reviewed the medical documentation from Henderson's treatment, and I need clarification on several procedures that appear to exceed standard field medical capabilities. Elena turned to face him with the respectful attention that medical professionals showed to colleagues, even when those colleagues were struggling to understand capabilities that fell outside their experience. Captain, Henderson's injuries required immediate surgical intervention that exceeded standard field medical protocols. The procedures were necessary to prevent fatal complications. Morrison placed a stack of medical reports on Martinez's desk with movements that suggested he was trying to process information that challenged his understanding of military medical practice. Dr. Vasquez, these surgical procedures typically require specialized equipment and controlled environments that aren't available in combat zones. How were you able to perform this level of intervention under field conditions? Elena looked at the medical documentation with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was reviewing her own work for accuracy and completeness. Captain, medical personnel with specialized training are equipped to provide advanced trauma care in environments that exceed standard operational parameters. The explanation was delivered with the kind of clinical precision that made Morrison realize he was dealing with someone whose medical training exceeded his understanding of standard military medical education. Elena's voice carried the particular quality of someone who had been in similar situations before and had learned to balance medical necessity with operational security. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez entered the debriefing room with the measured attention of someone who had spent the afternoon trying to understand tactical coordination that exceeded his experience with standard military operations. His expression reflected the respect of someone who had witnessed capabilities that challenged his assumptions about what was possible through normal channels. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, addressing Elena with the formal courtesy that senior non-commissioned officers used when they encountered personnel whose capabilities exceeded their understanding. "I need to understand the tactical coordination that resolved our engagement. The precision targeting that eliminated the Taliban positions involved resources that aren't listed in our standard operational database." Elena nodded with the kind of professional acknowledgement that suggested she had expected this conversation and was prepared to provide necessary clarification while maintaining operational security. "Sergeant, medical personnel sometimes have access to support resources that exceed standard tactical coordination when operational requirements demand enhanced capabilities." Rodriguez looked at Martinez with the expression of someone who was trying to balance curiosity with respect for operational security requirements. "Colonel, the tactical support that Dr. Vasquez coordinated was more advanced than anything I've seen in standard military operations. The precision targeting was surgical, the timing was perfect, and the execution exceeded our understanding of what's possible through normal channels." Martinez leaned back in his chair with the expression of someone who was trying to process multiple competing priorities simultaneously. Elena's presence had resolved a tactical situation that could have resulted in significant casualties, but had also raised questions about authorization, training, and operational capabilities that exceeded his ability to categorize through standard military frameworks. "Dr. Vasquez," Martinez said, his voice carrying the particular formality that senior officers used when they encountered situations that challenged their understanding of established protocols. "I need to understand the scope of your authorization and the nature of the resources you access during Alpha Company's engagement." Elena looked at him with the kind of direct gaze that conveyed both understanding and the need for operational security. "Colonel, my authorization extends to providing medical support that exceeds standard protocols when operational requirements demand enhanced capabilities. The specific nature of those capabilities is classified at levels that exceed standard briefing requirements." The explanation was delivered with the kind of calm authority that made Martinez realized he was dealing with someone whose operations fell outside normal military categories. Elena's voice carried the particular quality of someone who had been in similar briefings before and had learned to balance operational success with security requirements. Specialist Williams entered the debriefing room with the particular attention of someone who had spent the afternoon trying to process experiences that challenged his understanding of what was possible through standard military medical operations. His expression reflected the confusion of someone who had witnessed procedures that exceeded his training. "Colonel," Williams said, addressing Martinez with the respectful formality that junior personnel used when providing witness testimony, "I need to report on the medical procedures that Dr. Vasquez performed during our engagement. The surgical interventions were more advanced than anything I've seen in field medical training." Martinez gestured for Williams to continue, his expression suggesting he was prepared to hear testimony that would challenge his understanding of standard military medical capabilities. "Specialist, please describe what you observed during Dr. Vasquez's treatment of Private Henderson." Williams looked at Elena with the expression of someone who was trying to balance accurate reporting with respect for operational security. "Sir, Dr. Vasquez performed surgical procedures that typically require specialized equipment and controlled environments. She had access to medical instruments that exceeded standard field medical kits and demonstrated techniques that went beyond normal combat medicine training." Elena listened to Williams' testimony with the kind of professional attention that suggested she was monitoring the accuracy of his observations while maintaining awareness of operational security requirements. Her expression remained neutral, but her focus suggested she was prepared to provide clarification if necessary. "Specialist," Martinez said, his voice carrying the particular attention that senior officers used when trying to understand situations that exceeded their operational experience. Did Dr. Vasquez's procedures appear to be improvised responses to emergency conditions, or did they suggest systematic training in advanced medical techniques? Williams looked at Elena with the expression of someone who is trying to provide accurate testimony while respecting the capabilities he had witnessed. Sir, Dr. Vasquez's procedures were systematic and precise. Her equipment was specialized and organized for immediate use. Everything about her work suggested extensive training in advanced trauma surgery. Martinez made notes on his documentation with the methodical attention of someone who was trying to process information that challenged his understanding of standard military medical operations. Elena's presence had resolved a tactical situation successfully, but had also demonstrated capabilities that exceeded his ability to categorize through normal channels. Lieutenant Collins entered the debriefing room with the measured attention of someone who had spent the afternoon trying to understand tactical coordination that exceeded his experience with standard military operations. His expression reflected the gratitude of someone who had witnessed capabilities that had prevented casualties among his personnel. "Colonel," Collins said, approaching with the respectful formality that junior officers used when providing operational testimony, "I need to report on the tactical coordination that Dr. Vasquez provided during our engagement. The precision targeting that resolved our tactical situation involved resources that exceeded standard military coordination." Martinez looked at Collins with the expression of someone who was prepared to hear testimony that would challenge his understanding of standard military capabilities. "Lieutenant, please describe the tactical coordination that Dr. Vasquez provided during your engagement." Collins looked at Elena with the expression of someone who was trying to balance accurate reporting with respect for operational security. "Requirements. Sir, Dr. Vasquez coordinated precision targeting that eliminated Taliban positions with surgical efficiency. She had access to communication equipment that exceeded standard field medical kits and demonstrated tactical knowledge that went beyond normal medical training." Elena listened to Collins' testimony with the kind of professional attention that suggested she was monitoring the accuracy of his observations while maintaining awareness of operational security requirements. Her expression remained neutral, but her focus suggested she was prepared to provide necessary clarification. "Lieutenant," Martinez said, his voice carrying the particular attention that senior officers used when trying to understand situations that exceeded their operational experience. "Did Dr. Vasquez's tactical coordination appear to be improvised responses to emergency conditions, or did it suggest systematic training in advanced military operations?" Collins looked at Elena with the expression of someone who was trying to provide accurate testimony while respecting the capabilities he had witnessed. "Sir, Dr. Vasquez's tactical coordination was systematic and precise. Her communication equipment was specialized and configured for immediate use. Everything about her coordination suggested extensive training in advanced military operations." Martinez closed his documentation with the expression of someone who had collected sufficient testimony to understand the scope of what had occurred, even if the specific details exceeded his ability to categorize through standard military frameworks. Elena's presence had resolved a tactical situation that could have resulted in significant casualties, but had also demonstrated capabilities that challenged his understanding of standard military operations. "Dr. Vasquez," Martinez said, his voice carrying the particular formality that senior officers used when they encountered personnel whose capabilities exceeded their understanding. "Based on the testimony I've heard, it's clear that you provided medical and tactical support that exceeded standard protocols and resulted in successful mission completion with minimal casualties." Elena nodded with the kind of professional acknowledgement that suggested she had expected this assessment and was prepared to provide necessary clarification while maintaining operational security. Colonel, medical personnel are sometimes authorized to provide support that exceeds standard protocols when operational requirements demand enhanced capabilities. Martinez looked at Elena's dog tags with the expression of someone who was trying to understand classification markings that exceeded his security clearance. The identification information was partially obscured, but the authorization codes were clear enough to indicate capabilities that fell outside normal military categories. Dr. Vasquez, Martinez said, his voice carrying the particular attention that senior officers used when they encountered classification levels that exceeded their understanding. Your dog tags indicate authorization codes that I don't recognize. Can you clarify the nature of your operational authority? Elena looked at her dog tags with the kind of direct attention that suggested she was prepared to provide necessary explanation while maintaining operational security. Requirements. Colonel, my authorization extends to providing medical support that exceeds standard protocols when operational requirements demand enhanced capabilities. The specific classification details are maintained in databases that exceed standard access requirements. The explanation was delivered with the kind of calm authority that made Martinez realized he was dealing with someone whose operations were managed through channels that exceeded his operational awareness. Elena's voice carried the particular quality of someone who had been in similar situations before and had learned to balance operational legitimacy with security requirements. Martinez reached for his secure communication equipment with the expression of someone who was prepared to seek clarification through channels that exceeded standard operational coordination. Dr. Vasquez, I need to verify your authorization through appropriate channels. This is standard procedure when personnel demonstrate capabilities that exceed normal operational parameters. Elena nodded with the kind of professional understanding that suggested she had expected this verification process and was prepared to cooperate with necessary security protocols. Colonel, I understand the verification requirements. My authorization can be confirmed through appropriate channels, though the specific details may exceed standard briefing requirements. Martinez activated his secure communication equipment with the methodical attention of someone who was trying to process information through channels that exceeded standard operational coordination. His expression suggested he was prepared to discover authorization levels that would challenge his understanding of standard military operations. Command. This is Base Commander Martinez requesting verification of personnel authorization from Medical Officer Dr. Elena Vasquez. Classification codes indicate capabilities that exceed standard operational parameters. The response came back with the kind of professional efficiency that suggested Elena's authorization was maintained in databases that exceeded standard military coordination. Base Commander Martinez, Dr. Vasquez's authorization is confirmed through Special Operations Command. Classification level exceeds standard briefing requirements. Operational support is authorized at discretion of Field Commander. Martinez looked at Elena with the expression of someone who had just received confirmation that challenged his understanding of standard military operations. Elena's authorization was legitimate, but it was managed through channels that exceeded his operational awareness and involved capabilities that fell outside normal military categories. Dr. Vasquez, Martinez said, his voice carrying the particular respect that senior officers used when they encountered personnel whose authorization exceeded their understanding. Your operational support is confirmed through appropriate channels. I appreciate the capabilities you provided during Alpha Company's engagement. Elena nodded with the kind of professional acknowledgement that suggested she had expected this verification and was prepared to continue her deployment with minimal disruption to normal operations. Colonel, medical personnel are prepared to provide support that exceeds standard protocols when operational requirements demand enhanced capabilities. Martinez dismissed the other personnel with the efficient courtesy that senior officers used when they needed to conclude briefings. That involved sensitive information. Elena remained seated, her posture suggesting she was prepared to provide additional clarification if necessary while maintaining operational security requirements. Dr. Vasquez, Martinez said, his voice carrying the particular attention that senior officers used when they encountered personnel whose capabilities exceeded their understanding. I need to understand the scope of your operational authority and the nature of the resources you can access during future operations. Elena looked at him with the kind of direct gaze that conveyed both understanding and the need for operational security. Colonel, my authorization extends to providing medical support that exceeds standard protocols when operational requirements demand enhanced capabilities. The specific nature of those capabilities is classified at levels that exceed standard briefing requirements. The explanation was delivered with the kind of calm authority that made Martinez realize he was dealing with someone whose operations were managed through channels that exceeded his understanding of standard military coordination. Elena's voice carried the particular quality of someone who had been in similar situations before and had learned to balance operational effectiveness with security requirements. Elena stood up from her chair with the same purposeful movements she had shown throughout her deployment, her posture suggesting someone who was prepared to continue her operations with minimal disruption to established routines. Her medical bag was positioned beside her chair, containing equipment that everyone now understood exceeded standard field medical capabilities. "Colonel," Elena said, her voice carrying the professional courtesy that military personnel used when concluding formal briefings. Alpha Company completed their mission successfully with minimal casualties. Private Henderson is stable and receiving appropriate medical care. The tactical situation was resolved without loss of life among friendly forces. Martinez nodded, with the expression of someone who had gained significant appreciation for Elena's capabilities during the briefing process. "Dr. Vasquez, I want to thank you for the exceptional support you provided during Alpha Company's engagement. Your actions prevented casualties and ensured mission success." Elena accepted the acknowledgement with the kind of professional courtesy that suggested she was accustomed to recognition for exceptional performance, while maintaining focus on operational requirements rather than personal recognition. "Colonel, medical personnel are prepared to provide support that ensures mission success and personnel safety." Elena moved up toward the door with the same purposeful stride she had shown throughout her deployment, her movement suggesting someone who was prepared to continue her operations with minimal disruption to established routines. Her presence had resolved a tactical situation successfully, but had also demonstrated capabilities that would influence future operations. Martinez watched Elena leave the debriefing room with the expression of someone who had gained significant understanding of capabilities that exceeded his previous experience with standard military operations. Elena's presence had resolved a tactical situation that could have resulted in significant casualties, but had also demonstrated that some personnel operated under authorization that exceeded normal military categories. Elena returned to her assigned quarters with the same methodical efficiency she had shown throughout her deployment, her movements suggesting someone who was accustomed to maintaining operational readiness regardless of the circumstances. Her medical equipment was organized with surgical precision, every item in its designated place and configured for immediate use. The evening meal in the base dining facility was different when Elena entered. Conversations didn't stop, but they shifted in ways that acknowledged her presence, while maintaining the respectful distance that military personnel used when they encountered someone whose capabilities exceeded their understanding. Her presence had resolved a tactical situation successfully, but had also challenged assumptions about what was possible through standard military operations. Elena found a seat at an empty table with the same purposeful movements she had shown throughout her deployment, her posture suggesting someone who was comfortable in military dining facilities but had learned to maintain operational security. regardless of the social environment. Her meal was standard issue, but her presence transformed the atmosphere in ways that made everyone aware they were in the presence of someone whose service transcended normal categories. Specialist Williams approached Elena's table with the respectful attention of someone who had gained significant appreciation for her capabilities during their shared experiences. His expression reflected the curiosity of someone who had witnessed procedures that exceeded his understanding while maintaining respect for operational security requirements. "Ma'am," Williams said, addressing Elena with the formal courtesy that military personnel use when they encountered someone whose capabilities exceeded their understanding. "I wanted to thank you for the exceptional medical support you provided. During our engagement, your actions saved Henderson's life." Elena looked up from her meal with the kind of direct attention that suggested she was prepared to acknowledge his gratitude while maintaining focus on operational requirements rather than personal recognition. Williams, medical personnel are prepared to provide support that ensures personnel safety and mission success. The response was delivered with the kind of professional courtesy that made Williams realize Elena's capabilities extended beyond standard medical training while maintaining the modest professionalism that characterized genuine expertise. Elena's voice carried the particular quality of someone who had been in similar situations before and had learned to focus on results rather than recognition. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez joined Williams at Elena's table with the measured attention of someone who had gained significant respect for her capabilities during their shared tactical experience. His expression reflected the gratitude of someone who had witnessed coordination that had prevented casualties among his personnel. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, addressing Elena with the respectful formality that senior non-commissioned officers used when they encountered personnel whose capabilities exceeded their understanding. "I wanted to express appreciation for the tactical coordination you provided during our engagement. Your actions resolved a situation that could have resulted in significant casualties." Elena acknowledged Rodriguez's gratitude with the kind of professional courtesy that suggested she was accustomed to recognition for exceptional performance while maintaining focus on operational requirements. "Sergeant, medical personnel are sometimes authorized to provide support that exceeds standard protocols when operational requirements demand enhanced capabilities." Lieutenant Collins approached Elena's table with the respectful attention of someone who had gained significant appreciation for her capabilities during their shared operational experience. His expression reflected the gratitude of someone who had witnessed coordination that had ensured mission success while preventing casualties among his personnel. "Doc," Collins said, addressing Elena with the informal courtesy that military personnel used when they had shared challenging experiences. "I wanted to thank you for the exceptional support you provided during our patrol operation. Your actions ensured mission success and brought everyone home safely." Elena looked at Collins with the kind of direct attention that suggested she was prepared to acknowledge his gratitude while maintaining focus on operational requirements rather than personal recognition. "Lieutenant, medical personnel are prepared to provide support that ensures mission success and personnel safety." The conversations that followed were different from the dismissive comments that had characterized Elena's initial arrival at the base. Military personnel had learned to appreciate colleagues whose capabilities exceeded their job descriptions, whose service transcended normal categories, and whose contributions could only be measured by the lives they saved and the missions they made possible. Elena completed her meal with the same methodical efficiency she had shown throughout her deployment, her movement suggesting someone who was accustomed to maintaining operational readiness regardless of the circumstances. Her presence had challenged assumptions about what was possible through standard military operations, while demonstrating that some personnel operated under authorization that exceeded normal military categories. Elena returned to her quarters with the same purposeful stride she had shown throughout her deployment, her movement suggesting someone who was prepared to continue her operations with minimal disruption to established routines. Her medical equipment was organized with surgical precision, ready for immediate use when operational requirements demanded enhanced capabilities. The secure communication equipment in Elena's quarters activated with the particular tone that indicated priority communication from channels that exceeded standard military coordination. Elena responded with the professional efficiency of someone who maintained constant connection to support elements that operated beyond normal operational frameworks. Nightingale, this is command. Status report on tactical coordination during Alpha Company engagement. Elena's response was delivered with the kind of professional efficiency that suggested she maintained regular communication with people who understood the operational requirements of her specialized capabilities. Command, this is Nightingale. Tactical coordination successful. Friendly casualties minimized, mission objectives achieved. Local integration maintained within operational security parameters. The response came back with the kind of professional satisfaction that suggested Elena's performance had exceeded expectations while maintaining necessary operational discretion. Nightingale, this is command. Excellent work on tactical coordination. Continue mission support as required. Deployment extension authorized at your discretion. Elena looked at her deployment orders with the expression of someone who was prepared to continue operations that exceeded standard military coordination while maintaining integration with regular military units. Her presence had resolved tactical situations successfully, but had also demonstrated capabilities that would influence future operations. Elena's medical equipment was arranged with the same systematic precision she had shown throughout her deployment, each item configured for immediate use when operational requirements demanded enhanced capabilities. Her communication equipment was active but discreet, maintaining connection to support elements that operated beyond standard military coordination. The base settled into its evening routine with the controlled efficiency that characterized military operations, but Elena's presence had introduced variables that would influence future operations in ways that exceeded standard military planning. Her capabilities had been demonstrated successfully, but the specific details of her authorization would remain classified at levels that exceeded normal briefing requirements. Elena prepared for sleep with the same methodical efficiency she had shown throughout her deployment, her movements suggesting someone who was accustomed to maintaining operational readiness, regardless of the circumstances. Her medical bag was positioned for immediate access, containing equipment that exceeded standard field medical capabilities. The morning would bring new operational requirements, new challenges that would test Elena's capabilities, and new opportunities to demonstrate that medical personnel with specialized authorization were prepared to provide support that exceeded standard protocols. Elena's deployment would continue, her responsibilities would expand, and her capabilities would be tested in ways that would challenge her training and experience. Elena's presence had challenged assumptions about what was possible through standard military operations while demonstrating that some personnel operated under authorization that exceeded normal military categories. Her service transcended normal job descriptions. Her contributions could only be measured by the lives she saved and the mission she made possible. Elena's dog tags rested against her uniform, containing classification, markings that exceeded standard military categories, and represented capabilities that fell outside normal operational frameworks. Black Ops Classified. Special Operations. Command. Authorization codes that existed in databases that most military personnel would never access. Elena had proven that medical personnel with specialized authorization were prepared to provide support that exceeded standard protocols, using methods that fell outside normal medical practice while maintaining integration with regular military units. Her presence had resolved tactical situations successfully while demonstrating capabilities that would influence future operations. Elena's deployment would continue, her responsibilities would expand and her capabilities would be tested in ways that would challenge her training and experience. But she was prepared for whatever operational requirements would demand her unique combination of medical expertise and tactical capabilities. Elena's service represented the kind of quiet professionalism that characterized personnel whose contributions exceeded their official job descriptions, whose capabilities transcended normal military categories, and whose presence made the difference between mission success and mission failure. Elena's story would continue beyond this deployment, beyond this base, beyond the specific tactical situations that had revealed her capabilities. Her service would influence future operations, her capabilities would be tested in new environments, and her contributions would be measured by the lives she saved and the missions she made possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.